Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for having me. The presentation I'm going to give now takes something like the form of a meal, where there'll be a bit of a starter. The first course will kind of be about scenarios and strategy a little bit, and then the second course will more be about literature and storytelling. And then at the end, there'll be something like coffee and chocolates to finish things off. Just before we get underway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're each on and paying my respects to elders past and present. And this is a form of words which I learned to use in Australia, where I lived and worked for a long time, which is why we see here the flags of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia before us. And of course, in that context, acknowledging country is about acknowledging more than 200 years of colonial history and many thousands of years of history which went before that. But I think beyond that, when we come into these virtual international spaces like Romancing the Gothic, and especially when the topic of the talk is about the future and foresight and times to come, it's also about acknowledging that each of us is connected to a place which has a particular history, including histories of power and privilege, histories of who has rights and responsibility, who gets to say that they belong to a space or a space belongs to them. So thank you so much for allowing me to acknowledge country in this way, and thank you for welcoming me to this space. I'm really privileged to be joining you. I want to begin with that promised starter, which is this painting from 2010, Julian Bell's painting, which is called Darvaza, and it depicts a site in Turkmenistan, which the artist himself visited. Its name in Persian means the door to hell. And what's really interesting about this beautiful image, it's a giant pit in the ground where natural gas is constantly burning. It's not just about the way Bell conveys that site and its power, but it's also the story he tells about its origins. As Bell recounts, this blazing pit was inadvertently created by Soviet engineers in 1971 while they were seeking oil drilling sites. They struck a gas-filled cavity, and the engineers chose to burn off its contents, only to find that the resulting inferno went totally beyond their control, and it has continued to burn ever since. Now, Bell locates this painting in a tradition of artists seeking to convey a sense of the sublime, an intense aesthetic experience in which the self becomes a mere ingredient in the landscape, feeling insignificant, overwhelmed, and humbled by nature. And it's hard to see, but if you just peek around the edges of that pit, there is somewhere a tiny little human figure, just for scale, I think on the right-hand side, looking over the blaze of Darvaza. But in addition, in Bell's account, this hellish phenomenon was created by human technocratic actions. And his story of Darvaza also serves as an example of what Rafael Ramirez and Jerry Rabbids have called feral futures. They draw an analogy to domesticated animals that have reverted to the wild. So the notion is that tame situations are where everything works the way you expect, and when you make an intervention, you get the outcome that you predicted. Wild situations are where you know there are uncertainties and things beyond your control that might play out in ways which you can't predict. But feral situations are where you think you know what's going on, you make a rational intervention, and then because of your misunderstanding of the situation, because of corruption, because of incompetence, because of the tendency of systems to fail, because of misunderstanding, you actually get a mess which you cannot simply retrieve by throwing the lever into reverse, which you cannot solve by the form of thinking which got you into the problem in the first place. Or as they put it, where human intervention creates an unwanted, unfolding situation that could not have occurred in the wild. And the example we have here on the left-hand side is the Santa Barbara oil spill off the shore of California in 1969. And just like those Soviet engineers in Darvaza round about the same time, this was a group of people drilling for fossil fuels. And then oil and gas began to come back up the pipe that they had sunk, and a blowout began. So all these materials were being forced back up to the surface. And the engineers went through all kinds of procedures to try and stop the blowout, including ultimately sealing the top of the pipe where they had sunk the drill, only to find that some distance away from the drilling site, and you can see it here on the left-hand side, oil and gas had begun to tear through the floor of the ocean itself, and they were polluting the seas off the coast of California. Now, Ramirez and Rabbids argue that when you get into these feral situations, It's not about reasoning anymore. You can't reason your way out of this situation in the same way that your reasonable technocratic actions got you into them. Instead, it's a matter of aesthetics. You have to step back, re-perceive the situation, and not just rethink it according to the logic which caused the problem in the first place. And one of the things that's really interesting about this bird's eye view, which was disseminated in the American media at the time of the spill, is that the coverage of the Santa Barbara incident itself became an aesthetic object which focused American society on the need to rethink attitudes to the environment. So images like this were being circulated in the media, and this was also a time when Rachel Carson had published her book Silent Spring, which was so significant in nourishing the environmental movement. And also we'd seen images like this for the first time, Earthrise, seeing the Earth coming up from the lunar surface and reminding us of what Gayatri Spivak calls planetarity. Not globalization, that word which is so entangled with imperialism and notions of global trade, but the idea that we inhabit a single finite planetary system with humility. And we have to recognize that we are part of something bigger, which we might need to keep functioning in order to survive and thrive as a planet, as a world. And so images like these, along with works like Silent Spring, became that new aesthetic perspective, not just of the world we inhabit, but the impact that we were having on it. And that led to a couple of really interesting, lasting changes, certainly in American society and also to some extent internationally. One of them is Earth Day, which was only celebrated a few weeks ago this year in 2023. And this was founded as a result of the outrage around incidents like the Santa Barbara spill. And it was interesting because it brought together a coalition of environmental activists, ecologically minded conservatives, the labor movement, together in the recognition that something had to be done. And this movement also nourished the thinking that led the administration of Richard Nixon to found America's Environmental Protection Agency. So this sense of reperception and a new kind of intervention when we've seen this kind of systemic failure. Now, the thing is, we can even argue that the Anthropocene, that term which Christy Strange brought into her previous presentation in the Romancing the Gothic eco-horror series, that new epoch of geological time dominated by humans' impact on the Earth, we can argue that this too is an example of a feral situation clearly caused by our actions and attitudes. And we can even talk about the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic is also feral. The virus itself, of course, is wild. That's not the result of a human outcome, but its impacts are largely about the systems as well as the unique characteristics of the disease. Who is affected depends on things like global trade, like systems of public health, the ways in which our societies are configured to protect some people or to neglect the vulnerabilities of others. So there are feral aspects both to the whole environment we're living in today, but also even the pandemic that we have endured for the last few years. And as the disaster aid worker, social scientist and science fiction writer Malka Alder puts it, so-called natural disasters are increasingly understood as the result of an interaction between natural triggers or hazards and social vulnerabilities. Part of the reason that disasters happen is because of the ways in which our societies are configured, making some of us vulnerable. And some of these situations involve what Jerry Ravitz has called contradictions. Here meaning, in his words, a tension whose resolution or a problem whose solution is impossible in the terms of the currently accepted frameworks. And the question becomes, without having to endure crises like the Santa Barbara incident, how can we possibly gain the necessary distance and vantage point on the concerns of the here and now to step out of that old thinking, reframe the issues, and understand them afresh? Well, one way of finding that distance might be temporal as much as spatial. By moving to the vantage point of plausible imagined futures, we can look back on the concerns of the here and now from a fresh angle. Hence the notion of scenario planning. And this word is used in so many different ways, by so many different approaches and methodologies, different contexts, the IPCC reports on climate change. But here I'm talking about scenarios as defined on the screen within the Oxford scenario planning approach. And it means assessments of the future context, developed for a specific purpose that contrast with the ghost scenario, the way the future context is currently being framed. So these aren't necessarily predictions or projections. They're not necessarily about what we hope or fear, but it's ways of assessing the future that an entity or an issue, a community, or we ourselves might have to live in by looking at a contrasting set of potential futures, which don't just contrast with one another, but also with our own assumptions and expectations, whether those are explicit or tacit. Now, scenario planning originally arose in the Cold War as US military and political strategists sought ways to plan for an unprecedented nuclear conflict. This war was unimaginable, there was nothing to refer to in the past, and therefore planners sought to use different futures to help them think through choices and consequences in the present. For Herman Kahn, the model for cinema's Dr. Strangelove, scenarios offered strange aids to thought, providing ersatz or artificial experience and artificial case histories when decisions could not be based on times that had gone before. And subsequently, executives at the oil company Royal Dutch Shell brought scenario planning into the corporate sector. The scenario planner Pierre Vac and his colleagues emphasized that scenarios were not predictions or projections. They weren't just a matter of a line on the graph. They were futures intended to shift the mental model of decision makers. As he says here, unless we influence the mental image, the picture of reality held by critical decision makers, scenarios were like water on a stone. And what Vac called the aha moment came when a scenario user recognized that their previous mental model was flawed and they saw beyond its limits. Now, in some ways, that's quite a dark origin story, but it's not the only tributary that feeds into scenario thinking. And another part of the history we might like to trace goes back to the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and especially the organizational thinker Eric Trist. Together with Fred Emery, he wrote in 1965 about the causal textures of the environments that institutions inhabit, what's going on around them and how that might feel to them. And he brought in this word of turbulence, the sense that the ground, so to speak, beneath one's feet might feel unsteady in times of uncertainty. And this feeds into scenario planning through diagrams like the one in front of us here, where we see the idea that an organization facing uncertainty, facing turbulent times, uncertain what the future might hold, it's there in orange, and it inhabits a black transactional island, which is also inhabited by other actors with which it has direct relationships right here and right now. So we see an organization that deals with customers, suppliers, competitors, partners, governments, NGOs, and the general public. But beyond that transactional environment of actors and dynamics where there is some influence or control, there is a whole sea of contextual uncertainties waiting to come ashore, which the organization perceives to be out of its control, from geopolitics to macroeconomics, energy prices, social values, demographics, ecology, and technology. And then the art of scenario planning becomes about thinking through the ways in which those contextual uncertainties might come ashore singly or in combination in different ways to redraw the map of the transactional island which a learner inhabits. So the aim is not to predict the ways in which those forces come ashore, not just to look at desired or feared ways those forces come ashore, but to think how they might redraw the island in ways which challenge our assumptions and expectations. And just to give a sense of how contextual uncertainties can have that influence, we can think about a taxi driver in New York in the early 2000s. Imagine that that orange scenario learner was somebody who drove a yellow cab in the beginning of this century. And of course, if you are a yellow cab driver in the 2000s, everything on your transactional island works pretty much the way it has all the way through the 20th century. Your customers stand on a street corner, they raise their hand, you pull over and they tell you where they want to go. You charge a certain amount per mile that you travel or per minute that you wait. You might also have tolls to pay. There's a fixed fee to go to the airport. And then of course you also deal with a regular mechanic, with a gas station. You might compete with other taxi drivers, but also collaborate with them in a union. You might rent your cab from a cab company. And of course, you deal directly with the New York City government as well, because you have to invest in your New York taxi driver's license, which is a fairly expensive thing to buy, and it's called a medallion. But basically, things work quite straightforwardly on your transactional island. But what you might not see is that out there in the sea of uncertainty, different forces are waiting to come ashore, which are going to change relationships on the island you inhabit. So there might be technological changes, regulatory changes, changes in social values. The technological change, for example, might be the arrival of the smartphone. Regulatory changes might be that the city of New York decides to deregulate certain aspects of personal transportation. And then the really interesting one is the change in social values, where ordinary Americans decide, actually, I'm going to give complete strangers a lift in my automobile for money. And when those three forces come ashore together, then you get ride-sharing services like Lyft and Uber, you get that map redrawn, and even the notion of, is it a good idea to invest in a New York taxi driver's medallion, might be changed in that new world which you find yourself inhabiting. Now, that's just a pretty bread and butter example, but gives us a sense of the practicalities of how these uncertainties might affect an environment where we perceive ourselves to have agency. One of the things I want to pull out here, though, that really intrigues me is that this is not a map of the future in any way. This is a map of perceived agency in the here and now. And I think of scenarios not as futures work, but in Donna Haraway's sense, a way of staying with the trouble, not letting us get sucked into utopias or dystopias or too much confidence in our own predictions, but acknowledging that there are uncertainties, and they might be as much about what we perceive as what is really going on around us. And what this means is that when we make scenarios, we're not in the business of manufacturing desired futures. Rather, it's a bit like what the American philosopher John Dewey once said, which is that you can find great new ideas by reflecting on a felt difficulty, thinking about the ways in which these uncertainties could come ashore that we didn't expect or prepare for, experiencing and feeling those difficulties when we encounter a challenging scenario can thereby become the ground for ideas which are both new and practical. And as we do this, our sense of the world is reframed, our mental model might be changed through unlearning as much as relearning, and we reperceive what is going on around us, which includes bringing in what the Danish writer Tor Nordetrenes calls exformation, or explicitly discarded information. And in his 1990s book, The User Illusion, Nordetrenes says, this is all the stuff that's taken for granted, that we don't mention, but it's there and it underpins our conversations and our communications. But in the quarter century since this word was coined, other thinkers, particularly the designer Kenya Hara and the design academic Cassini Nazir, have developed this concept even further. And they say exformation is more than just the implicit context for a conversation. It's also the way encryption works, because the way to decode the code is part of that exformation. It's the basis for visual and verbal puns. I know puns are very important to the culture of romancing the Gothic, so maybe there'll be some exformation exercises there. It's how we design mazes and puzzles, because there's something that we can't see, otherwise we'd solve that puzzle immediately. And it's even the suspense we experience when we're waiting to see how Wile E. Coyote's latest plot to catch the Roadrunner will fail. We know it's not going to work out, but we might not be able to see how yet. And for Nazir, exformation also encompasses the universe of knowledge which we have yet to discover, the place to which our curiosity calls us. Incorporating exformation into our mental models through conversations about the future can be part of strategic reframing. When our past experience no longer provides a useful map for what lies ahead, and when our habits of thinking are causing us to exclude vital information from our understanding of a situation, we are forced to look beyond habit and custom. Owen Morowitz said just recently in the talk that preceded mine in this series, he cited Mark Fisher saying, the weird thing is not wrong after all, it is our conceptions which must be inadequate. But that act of rethinking your conceptions and reframing can be shocking and overwhelming, as well as instructive and absolutely necessary to our survival, finding ways to accommodate the weird, to change ourselves or change our understanding. And the thing that I love, the thing that connects us to Darvaza here, is that for Norretreners, this act of truly facing up to what is going on beyond our model is the sublime. He writes, the sublime experience is one where we draw on our entire apparatus for experiencing and dare to mark the world as it really is. Chaotic and contradictory, dread-provoking and menacing, painful and merry, daring to experience what is, even if it is unpleasant. Now, seeing as I've come to the S word, we have to do a little bit of digging on the sublime. And as Emily Brady says in her wonderful book, The Sublime in Modern Philosophy, it's a bit of a problem because it's such a huge word. It's been around for so long, for 2000 years really, but of course, really coming into a particular significance since the 18th century. She says the concept's become too broad for its own good, maybe, losing its central meaning through all the transformations over the centuries and from being treated from so many different perspectives. She says it stood for the effect of grandeur in speech and poetry, for a sense of the divine, for the contrast between the limitations of human perception and the overwhelming majesty of nature. It's been used as proof of the triumph of reason over nature and imagination, and most recently, she says, it's been a signifier for that which exceeds the grasp of reason. But one thing she says, which I take forward here, is the notion that in aesthetic situations marked by sublimity, imagination and the senses are challenged, and there are limits to what we take in and grasp. And one of the things I like about the way she unpacks this is she notes that the experience of the sublime, just like Julian Bell visiting Darvaza, offers not just that immediacy and intensity of seeing a blazing hole in the ground or a lightning storm or a tremendous mountainous landscape, but there's also a degree of safety and disinterestedness. She says, as a baseline, actual physical safety is crucial for enjoying the spectacle. We don't experience real fear. We feel the response of trying to entertain something which is beyond us, but we're not actually running for the hills. We couldn't engage in this aesthetic connection if we were not in some position of safety. We can't feel too safe because we need to feel sufficiently close to the action to experience the strong negative emotions associated with the sublime. That's what she argues. And the other thing, I just want to dig one more sort of layer deeper into this hole of ground, perhaps without releasing an enormous gas pocket and starting a giant inferno. We'll try and avoid that. But she also says that the sublime is entwined with uncertainty itself, because if it was predictable, we could master it, and then the sublime would become tame. She says the unpredictability of nature is exactly why we cannot turn the sublime on and off. And it resonates with John Milbank's work on the sublime, where he says the unknown is not simply that which cannot be represented, but it is also that which arrives, which ceaselessly but imperfectly makes itself known again in every new event. In this sense, the uncertainty of the future is itself sublime. And one of the things that excites me is the notion that maybe scenarios, by offering what Kahn called ersatz or artificial experience, offer us opportunities to actively reflect on our own capacities, to imagine, to reason, to make decision, to face up to things which were beyond our previous model. And they have this quality of immediacy and intensity, reflecting on a felt difficulty, still being able to think, not having lost ourselves completely to terror, but acknowledging that we are right on the cusp of that which overwhelms. And having spent some time with the S words, the sublime, it is romancing the Gothic. So we come bang in the middle of things to the G word, to Gothic itself. And for me, this was my way into the conversation that we're having right now and the very reason we're here. And I'm so lucky and so grateful to be part of this conversation that Sam has been orchestrating for so long. I was reading Layla Taylor's book, Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul, talking about the connections between African-American experience and Gothic culture in different forms. And Layla Taylor uses this phrase. We've heard this sentiment or this analysis in many different ways, but I think it's put so well here. Gothic narratives were, and still are, a means of working through the discomfort of a changing world through the safety of fiction. And this might not be a unique or novel argument, but in the context of her book and the urgency of contemporary calls for racial justice in the United States and elsewhere, it's a reminder that the Gothic is still doing this work today very much. And it also reminds us that Gothic narratives, like scenarios, help people to process the discomfort of a changing world through the safety of fiction, and that there might even be a kinship between Gothic tales and the kind of scenarios I've been describing in the first part of this conversation. I'd argue that that kinship lies precisely in their entanglement with the sublime. When Fred Botting writes on Gothic, he talks about this question of a philosophical fascination with displeasing aesthetic experience leading to the origins of the Gothic, and saying, in contrast to beauty, the sublime resulted from a disrupted sense of order and a discombobulation of reason, imagination, and feeling. Intensities, magnitudes, and violent contrasts overwhelmed mental faculties, evoking terror, awe, wonder, and threatening the eclipse of any subjective unity. And for Botting, that encounter with the sublime that threatens the perceiving self may also permit something. It may liberate us because it allows the move, he says, from an experience of threatened limitations to a reinvigorated idea of mental capacities, a shocking or thrilling experience, a dynamic process that involves both loss and recovery. One of the delights and joys and rewards of allowing ourselves to become involved with the Gothic. And such narratives allow us to vicariously experience all kinds of shocking, transgressive encounters and discoveries. Dark magic, mad science, the exposure of shameful family secrets, and visits to places where reality's frames have ceded to supernatural forces or to powers of hallucination or unconscious desire, Botting writes. It gives the sense, he says, that the contours of the world in which one defines oneself seem to have changed radically. And Roger Luckhurst wrote in his book from a couple of years back, the Gothic has become a place where unspeakable stories might find voice. Now, what really excites me is that people might think that scenarios are science fictional because they're set in the future, but I think there's something here in the kinship with the Gothic, which is actually much more rewarding for us to explore. And these narratives that we're talking about might be set in the past, present, or future. The protagonists of Dracula face an ancient evil, but they deploy modern technology like blood transfusions in their battle against the vampire, which arguably makes Bram Stoker the father of the techno-thriller genre practiced by the likes of Michael Crichton. And I've had to put his greater medical sci-fi, The Andromeda Strain, up there. Talk about scientists battling an emergent infectious disease. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein too, of course, owes a debt to the Gothic. The genre is present at the very birth of modern science fiction. And of course, I had to choose this cover from Dover Thrift Editions because it has this lovely painting, Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which I always want to call Wanderer Above the Sea of Frogs, unhelpfully, but which has exactly this sublime experience of encountering this vista, this single figure, like the person standing at the edge of Darvaza, looking over the immensity and the wonders of nature. But fantastic futures are just as useful a staging ground for Gothic tales as any other. And I just love this British Film Institute compendium, Days of Fear and Wonder, edited by James Bell, which has this great image of Ripley perceiving the xenomorph. We're not seeing the alien itself, but we're seeing someone taking it in and reperceiving what exists within their universe. An ancient evil woken from an alien spaceship to stalk the corridors of this far future human freighter, this creature which is somehow biomechanical, that refuses to sit nicely in categories, and which stalks, coming from these ancient ruins, very much like the ghost in the castle of Otranto going back in the day. There's this amazing resonance between the past and the future, where in both cases, and just like scenarios, these monstrous things are giving shape to obscure fears or anxieties. containing, as Botting says, an amorphous and otherwise unrepresentable threat in a single image, thinking about what the monster can stand for. Now, even if scenarios are unlikely to feature supernatural or extraterrestrial actors, they still condense and make apprehensible forces and uncertainties which have not actually yet played out in the here and now. Stories of the futures which we may one day inhabit allow for reframing, unlearning, and the unsettling of even our most fundamental assumptions that can be, as Botting says of Gothic fiction's encounter with the sublime, reconfigured through an imaginative and active process. And I really have to stay 1 minute more with that absolutely glorious cover. I really, really feel so disappointed they didn't make a poster from the cover of this book, because it is such a perfect capture of that moment that the sublime is about us as the perceiver being challenged and reframed. I think there's such a great moment stolen on film and then shared before us here now, to the point I've become slightly incoherent even trying to give an account of it. This process we've been talking about of reframing through an encounter with something beyond our frame of understanding echoes, of course, Julian Bell's artistic feat in communicating his experience at Darvaza. And it also aligns with what Ramirez and Ravitz were saying was the proposed remedy to the challenge of feral futures, drawing on aesthetic appreciation rather than reasoning to make sense of them. What one feels about something, Ramirez and Ravitz say, is the beginning of what one knows. And they go on to argue that an aesthetic appreciation thus invites us to drop our established labels and to consider what we feel anew. And just to continue weaving those threads to previous installments in Romancing the Gothic's eco-horror series, I know that literally just yesterday, I'm speaking now on the 22nd of May or 21st of May, there was a discussion of Annihilation, the first book in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. And Owen Morowitz presented really, really well on the book and the subsequent film. And I want to speak just a little bit now about the second book in that trilogy, because one of the ways of reading these novels is as the story, very much like the Santa Barbara oil spill and the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency, the story of a government agency being founded to deal with Area X, a place where the laws of nature, where reality as we understand it, no longer applies. And the second book in this series, whose protagonist is Control, the newly appointed head of the agency, is fascinating because we see precisely how the world of bureaucracy, the world of rational government policy cannot cope with Area X. And what happens is not merely that the weird begins to bleed into the agency, but that the agency itself has become entirely dysfunctional, that the former director is running around somewhere in the neighborhood and still meddling with the office politics of the organization, that poor hapless Control is not able to find a way even to manage the work of containment, let alone understanding or intervention in the unfolding, expanding condition of Area X, this mysterious space in the United States where the world is behaving otherwise. And one of the things I really like is a moment where one of Control's operatives suggests understanding Area X using the winemaker's term of the terroir, saying terroir's direct translation is a sense of place. And what it means is the sum of the effects of a localized environment in as much as they impact the qualities of a particular product. That it's not about science, it's not about an analytical understanding completely, it's also about aesthetic appreciation, including that which we grow and that which we might imbibe. And the operative goes on to say, the point of terroir is that no two areas are the same, that no two wines can be exactly the same because no combination of elements can be exactly the same, that certain varietals cannot occur in certain places, but it requires a deep understanding of a region to reach conclusions. So we have a moment in this book gloriously where secret agents are trying to think like winemakers in order to understand an outbreak of the weird, which is totally beyond their capacity to handle professionally or systemically. Now, I felt the need to put some real scenarios into the mix here and nourish the conversation, just that we'd actually looked at this kind of work in action. So at this point, I want to talk momentarily about the Imagine project, which was a European Commission funded project to look at questions of regional inequality across Europe. And thankfully, the members of Imagine didn't face anything like Area X. It was nothing like what the Southern Reach might went to, and nobody transformed into a rabbit creature, which is ultimately what happens to control. But instead, everyone more or less maintained their identity and their integrity. 16 institutions across 13 countries and numerous researchers were looking essentially at the question of, do Europeans have equal rights and responsibilities regardless of where they live in Europe? Is your ability to live your life to the full affected by geography, affected by where you are? And one of the things that became really clear was you could do empirical research. You could look at the distance between the haves and the have-nots as we understand them today and see if that gap got narrower or wider, but that was insufficient in a changing world. And what is more, we realized that this notion of spatial justice was not something where you could run the numbers. Even when you think of a court of law where they say they're deciding a case on the balance of probability, nobody calculates justice. Instead, we adjudicate as a community between competing narratives and understandings. And that meant we had to think about what justice meant for Europe in times to come. Amartya Sen in the book, The Idea of Justice, says, there is no universal yardstick. There is no single perfectly just imaginary against which all circumstances can be judged once and for all. Instead, justice may be seen as a question of our capabilities and liberties within a given context. And to the extent that that is a historical context, even when we're living it in the here and now, that means that different future contexts, different scenarios may provide us with useful perspectives on the challenges we face even right here and right now. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the future, because in the case of Imagine, this work meant over a period of years generating 4 scenarios for Europe in the middle of the 21st century, in which the dynamics of capitalism, regional identity, virtual technology, geopolitics, even sexuality and gender identity were redrawn in different ways. In each version of Europe in the year 2048, spatial justice, this notion of what is right and fair between regions, was construed differently, and different forms of injustice and exclusion occurred across future geographies, which not only contrasted with each other, but also with those of contemporary Europe. In Silver Citadel, starting right there at the top left, an expanded and deeply centralized European power bloc used artificial intelligence to manage economic prosperity and equity across its territories under a new centralized state capitalism. Moving clockwise, in Green Guardian, a post-capitalist global order arose in response to the ravages of climate change. And this led to a society whose overriding priorities were sustainability, survival, and well-being, with the economics of profit and net worth giving way to those of yield and fair share. In Patchwork Rainbow there on the bottom right, diverging and hard to reconcile cultural and social norms across Europe caused the continent to form a mosaic of regions that couldn't even agree on fundamentals of identity or truth, couldn't even agree on how many genders there were in different parts of Europe anymore. And because the EU fragmented, this mosaic was increasingly dependent on relationships and alliances with more stable powers elsewhere in the world, creating a much more complicated geopolitics. And finally, in the bottom left, in Silicon Scaffold, social and economic and everyday life migrated almost entirely to privatized virtual spaces, and corporate city-states eclipsed national governments, life in the corporate clouds. This is just to give you a sense of what it looks like when this stretch happens. You know, we had the example of the taxi driver, but this is what it feels like at that whole of Europe institutional level. And of course, the work had strategic impacts and policy impacts. It was cited in the long-term vision for the EU's rural areas. Europe's innovation agencies used it to think about what they might need to do and who they might need to become in a changing world. But for me, the most interesting insight the most exciting bit of learning, and one which keeps us close to those Gothic concerns of the body and the ways in which it might be vulnerable or changeable. This most exciting response came from Gail Carson at the Centre for Tropical Medicine and Global Health at the University of Oxford. And she is also chair of the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, which is affiliated to the World Health Organization. And it consists of top infectious disease medics who bring together expertise and resources and move it across the world whenever an infectious disease outbreak becomes too much for any one nation state to handle. So you can imagine they were exceedingly busy during the early stages of the pandemic. And what Gail Carson said is that actually COVID-19 had exposed a lot of systemic weaknesses and injustices within public health systems around the world, and that exposure was as significant as the virus itself. And when she looked at these 4 futures and said, what would infectious disease look like in each future? Who would suffer? How would it be addressed? What public health measures would be in place? What preventative measures would be in place? She said, looking at these scenarios can identify systemic weaknesses before we have to endure the next hit. Doing that work of identification and early intervention would be an honorable thing to do with these scenarios. So an example from the era of COVID-19 is migrant workers in Singapore. That Singaporeans often don't think about migrant workers as part of their day-to-day life. The migrant workers were living in barracks where it was very easy for the coronavirus to spread. So precisely a vulnerability existed in this society that was systemic and had gone unheeded until the crisis arose. And so the question became, if we took that vantage point of an imagined future and manufactured hindsight for ourselves, what might we see before the crisis arose, before people had to suffer or experience injustice? And I want to take that even further and stay just ghostly enough that we really feel like we belong in the realm of romancing the Gothic by drawing on the work of Esther Perrin, who wrote an amazing book called The Spectral Metaphor: Living Ghosts and the Agency of Invisibility. Perrin explores marginalized figures such as migrants, servants, the homeless, asylum seekers, and missing persons. People who sometimes slide out of the corner of people's eye, who aren't seen or detected or acknowledged in mainstream culture. People always at the margins of what is framed into consideration. She says they become likened to ghosts or related figures on the basis of their lack of social visibility, unobtrusiveness, enigmatic abilities, or uncertain status between life and death. Spectrality for Perrin arises from conditions that are imposed in real life encounters, especially with vulnerable subjects, she says. Their very invisibility and exile from the domain of the fully living and fully recognized occurs, just like Amartya Sen's idea of justice, within a specific historical and social context. And this means that, as with the different notions of spatial justice brought to light by the imagined scenarios, each manufactured plausible future context can also potentially shed light on the presence of spectral figures who are marginalized or rendered wholly or partly invisible when we look at them through the frame of the present day. That is to say that in each future, we might see figures who are obscured in 2023. And that when we look back from 2048, different versions of 2048, we might see emerging marginalizations, we might see injustices, or we might even get a fresh perspective on the systemic inequalities, which, just like the inability to reason your way out of a feral future, we have been unable to reconcile within the confines of our current way of thinking. And this is where I want to make that connection to Layla Taylor again and her brilliant book, Darkly, because the most challenging parallel that one might draw between recognition of spectral status in a scenario, whether your own spectral status and that of others, is with the experience of systemic racial injustice. Vanita Blackburn, in a 2019 essay, wrote of a neurological experience of sleep paralysis, which is sometimes called the witch's wake, which she had experienced, where a dreamer returns to consciousness and finds themselves in an unresponsive body. She describes it as follows: the whole body becomes a tomb and the mind is a ghost, skimming the space between the living and everything else. I remember screaming when it happened, hard, loud, in tears, and yet I was silent. I say this because it is the nearest analogy for explaining not just the Black experience in America, but the white experience as well. There is a seam between consciousness and sleep, between the wreckage of the body and being able to see the forces that attack it. The Black American is born on that seam, that fragile space of knowing your physical self is in peril and being unable to act. We watch our bodies wrecked for the economic and sadistic benefit of whiteness, and our screams are silenced through disbelief. Blackburn goes on to address the equivalent experience of white Americans who wake up to the racial injustice of US society. To give up whiteness, she says, is to become vulnerable, to confront the deep tears in the psyche gouged over generations, to see hate in the face of a loved one and name it, and therefore open yourself up to being seen and ultimately touched. It is not the marginalized people, the Black and brown bodies under assault, who carry the burden of saving this nation. They carry only the burden of seeing the flames first. And I just want to acknowledge that connection between the question of whose responsibility it is to see the flames first, and that notion of what arises and what comes to the surface and what is generated by a system and may not be resolved within that system. Catherine Yusof, in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes, reminds us of the ways in which all identities are historically constituted, and some of them as a result of a history of violence against certain identities and certain subjectivities. And if identities are historically constituted, they can also be examined in terms of future context, in terms of different ways that the uncertainties of the present might play out, and in terms of different ways of resolving issues that have been caused by the current system and the current way of thinking. With exclusions and oppressions which are only potential or incipient, also, might it be possible for scenarios and this kind of conversation that encounters the sublime to reveal the first sparks of future flames before the burden is imposed upon the bodies of the marginalized who are yet to come? I want to let that sit as a kind of unresolved chord that we might return to. Just to really continue that conversation, I was thinking about the way that Pierre Vac said that there was this aha moment when you realized that your mental model was no longer working, having visited a scenario or a set of scenarios. And that was the moment in which a scenario triggered reperception. And in the context of these issues and conversations, it might seem more like the feeling which the Black British writer Geoffrey Batchy articulates in his poem, Why They Won't Be Woke, writing, but you only realize you have a disease when you are awake enough to feel the symptoms, so people don't know they're unwell. Then the disease becomes easy, like how a coma is easy, and being awake becomes hard, uneasy, and waking up becomes traumatic. All of this put me in mind of the work of Mimi Onuoha on data, evidence, and proof when it comes to addressing issues of systemic injustice. And she points to the fact that data and evidence have never been enough to bring about justice in the face of structural racism, that it is not a case of if only one could show enough evidence, or if only one had enough video footage, or if only one could prove to the authorities that something had happened, then things would be put right. She echoes Baldwin's words after desegregation in saying, love, justice, data, alone, none have been enough. By considering the vast context, we can save ourselves from tacitly reinforcing the idea that structural violence matters only when it can be compressed into a form that fits what we recognize as evidence. And in doing so, we give ourselves new frames for thinking about the many people who have died at the hands of brutality and whose deaths were not recorded. So just as Layla Taylor was brave enough in her book to touch on the absolute rawest nerves of our culture, I just want to acknowledge that this conversation about considering a vaster context, about reframing and changing systemic thinking, goes way beyond taxi drivers and oil spills and even links between Gothic stories and the Sublime, but actually it's things that are absolutely at the crux of what might be wrong with our societies and the way we live today, and the things that must be addressed for there to be justice. I'll let those thoughts just resonate and continue, allow that unresolved chord to play out as we move into the final section of this conversation. Because the last thing I want to think about is the notion of scenarios as a way of storytelling. And in Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, Ghosh talks about the inadequacy of the bourgeois literary novel to cope with the uncertainties of climate change. He says that bourgeois storytelling is so dependent on certain kinds of regularities, certain kinds of expectations about how life is lived, which are in turn dependent on colonialism and capitalism. And so then when you have all the uncertainties and catastrophe of climate change playing out, the novel, as it is construed, is just not the form that is able to really give a meaningful, useful aesthetic account of those circumstances. Ghosh writes, interestingly, that probability and the modern novel are in fact twins, born at about the same time, among the same people, under a shared star that destined them to work as vessels for the containment of the same kind of experience, a way of restricting the ways we understand the world. And MIT's Rodrigo Ochigami has written really interestingly about the origins of the notion of algorithmic fairness and the idea that these actually stem from the insurance industry and the needs of the actuarial industry to think, what is going to happen? What are the chances of this happening? Am I going to have to pay out? And the entanglement of this with novelistic storytelling is fascinating to me in the ways it limits our understanding and communication of experience. And yet it needn't have been this way. When we look back to the early days of the novel, when we think of Dickens writing his serials, the Irish novelist Joseph O'Connor said this so beautifully. He said, when he reads early novels, it's like punk rock. It's like people seeing how far they can stretch this form, maybe not even in ways that are especially artful. When you think of a dinosaur moving through central London at the very beginning of Bleak House, although it is in fact, of course, a bus, there's this sense of really challenging reality just as much as Vandermeer does with Area X. And it happens when there are these uncertainties about the environment which we're inhabiting. I see something similar happening in Robert Musil's enormous, sprawling European novel, The Man Without Qualities. 3 volumes, which very tellingly went unfinished, set in 1913, on the eve of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with all that regularity and control and assumptions about a certain way of life. Even the very opening chapter of this book really strains at the notion of novelistic storytelling. It begins with the meteorology of Austria, with a weather front coming in from over the Atlantic. It turns into an observation of Vienna street scenes. It hints at the intimacy of maybe people having an affair, walking secretively through the streets of Vienna. And then there's a road accident. And there's an attempt to have a snapshot of a moment in the life of Vienna, which goes beyond the idea of we're going to watch a protagonist move through a sort of set of circumstances in an orderly world. Or we could think of a much more slender, more recent and equally powerful novel, Nawal al-Saadawi's book, Love in the Kingdom of Oil, a surreal short novel which suggests we can only understand the entanglement of extractivism and patriarchy through a kind of storytelling that pushes at the limits of common sense. This book with nameless characters is set in a world which feels almost like a grotto, where every wall is dripping with oil, oil which we imbibe as well as extract and trade, oil which can even power magic typewriters by which even the illiterate can write in any language. It's such an unusual challenge to the whole notion of common sense, but it lays bare the entanglement of the extractive industries and patriarchy. And the final example I want to give of this kind of writing busting at the seams is W.G. Sebalt's Vertigo. Again, trying to face up to one of these structural systemic issues, not just the memory of the Holocaust, but specifically the memory of German culpability in the Holocaust. And this book refuses to quite be a novel, refuses to quite be a memoir, refuses to quite be a travel guide, something where there is a character who shares biographical details with the author, where there are elements of historical research, but also outright fabrications, moments of completely unusual and eerie happenstance, which make me wonder if there is a future Romancing the Gothic piece to be presented about Sebald. I know I would sign up for that straight away. So the reason I've looked at that pushing at the very edge of genre is to really ask, might scenarios themselves actually be a kind of literary genre? In the book Strategic Reframing, which sets out the Oxford scenario planning approach, that one with the island and the sea and the taxi drivers we started with, the authors, Ramirez and Wilkinson, say that the novel, like the scenario, enables conversational relations between readers and the writer in reading and rereading. That is, it's a place where we don't come to a final and authoritative answer, but a place where we can have discussion and debate, where we can have this experience of aesthetic reperception, where we can reframe what is going on. But I wonder if it really has anything to do with the novel at all. They draw on the work of Carlos Fuentes, but I think maybe comparing a set of imagined future contexts designed to challenge our assumptions actually is a genre in its own right. And the storied scenario planner Betty Sue Flowers, who is an emeritus poetry professor at UT Austin, suggests that maybe scenarios are more like poems, ways of speaking something into reality, which encourages us to unlearn as well as relearn our assumptions. And just bringing the plane into land now for the final approach, I really want to mark that resonance with the previous lectures I've referenced by Owen and by Christie, and think about Anne Kaplan's climate trauma, the notion that trauma culture is about people living in fear of imminent disaster and fears of future threat, which come to dominate our consciousness. And something that I've noticed happening in fiction, which discusses some of these issues, is actually a willingness to reckon with the catastrophe beyond the notion that it is an absolute end of things. Annalee Newitz, who's just published this book, The Terraformers, was speaking at Stanford's D School this week, and she said, what I really want to do with my storytelling is get people imagining that we could fix stuff. It doesn't have to be perfect. We could just make it not suck, and that would be step one. And then we'll work on making it even better. There's something there about that notion of the transactional and the contextual, reckoning with the limits of our own agency. And Malka Older, herself a disaster relief worker, as well as a sci-fi author and academic, her most recent novella, The Mimicking of Known Successes, has an explicitly cozy quality, which she said she wanted as a kind of antidote to the traumas of the pandemic. But even others of her books, like the Infomocracy series, don't present absolute utopia or dystopia. Instead, they offer problematic, ambivalent alternative worlds, which let us, like scenarios, scrutinize the choices we are making about power, privilege, privacy, and information flow in the here and now. And that word cozy that I've just used makes me want to revisit good old John Wyndham, because Brian Aldiss, many years ago, in a bit of a sideswipe, named Wyndham's books as cozy catastrophes, which I think was a bit harsh, actually. If we think of Wyndham as a particular brand of post-World War II eco-horror, his futures are often feral. Those triffids, the walking carnivorous plants which come to dominate the planet, they're the result of human selective breeding, and they're part of the agricultural system. They're being farmed for their oil. His stories often leave the world, and indeed his protagonists, irrevocably changed. However even-tempered they may seem as they endure the catastrophe, that's not coziness. It's actually about what is being carried forward into that changed world. And most importantly, his novels become stories of problem solving. And in that way, they resonate with the idea that scenarios are about agency, the perception of what we can and cannot control, the idea that we tell stories about the futures we didn't see coming, precisely in order that we are not paralyzed by our encounter with the sublime in the face of a changing, uncertain world. Now, you've been kind and generous with your attention, and you've stayed with me for the courses of this meal, and that means we have got to the coffee and the chocolate at the end, because what I want to do is come back to painting, and indeed back to Julian Bell, who in the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books writes about this image, Adam Elsheimer's flight into Egypt from 1609. And what makes this so fascinating is actually the night sky overhead, because the way in which it's depicted is so good, and so accurate that we can actually calculate, would this have been the right constellation of stars in the sky on a given night when he might have painted it? It makes us wonder, did Elsheimer have access to a telescope? They'd only recently been invented, and there were so few of them in Europe, we can almost track where the telescopes were in this time. And so Bell asked, is it possible that he actually had a telescope to look through at the night sky when he painted this? He was seeing the sky more clearly than others had before. Telescopes and scenarios both had original military applications. They also became tools of commerce, science, and simply our sense of wonder at a world which is too big and too uncertain, too sublime perhaps for us to ever fully understand. Yet actually telescopes and scenarios are ultimately both technologies of perception, one of them using a juxtaposition of lenses, and the other one bringing together words, bringing together people in a form of conversation or literary interaction to challenge our mental models of what is going on around us. Ultimately, when we think of scenarios as literary objects, stories of the futures that we didn't see coming, and perhaps specifically as Gothic literary objects, what we are doing is challenging ourselves to see the world more clearly in a way which might allow us to act upon it and perhaps even ultimately make it more just for all. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for staying with me. And on that note, we open it up to the group. Thank you.